The Duke knew something was wrong before his bride ever turned around. The wedding feast had ended hours ago. The musicians were gone, the candles in Ravenscroft Manor were burning low, and the corridors had finally fallen silent. Yet when Duke Alexander entered the bridal chamber, expecting only the stiff awkwardness of a marriage, arranged more by circumstance than affection, he found Isabella sitting beside the window in her wedding gown, quietly crying. For a moment, he simply stood there. She wiped her cheeks quickly, but not quickly enough, and Alexander reached the conclusion he had been dreading all evening. She regretted marrying him. The Hartwell family had been drowning in debt, and everyone knew what becoming Duchess of Ravenscroft had saved Isabella from. Alexander had always suspected she had accepted his proposal for security rather than love. Seeing those tears seemed to confirm it, but Isabella's startled expression told him he had misunderstood something. Then, an old folded letter slipped from her trembling hand and landed near his feet. Alexander bent to retrieve it. The instant he saw the broken wax seal, his entire expression changed. It bore the Ravenscroft crest. More disturbing still, he recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to his father. His father had been dead for years, yet the letter was not addressed to Alexander. It was addressed to Isabella's mother. Beside it lay another document, dated 18 years earlier. And when Isabella quickly pulled that document against her chest, Alexander understood that her tears were hiding something much larger than an unhappy wedding night, something their families had buried for 18 years. And once Alexander discovered the truth, he would realize his bride had never been crying because she regretted marrying him. 3 weeks earlier, nothing about the marriage had looked like love. Isabella Hartwell had already lost almost everything by the time Duke Alexander Ravenscroft asked for her hand. Her father was dead. The Hartwell estate was buried beneath years of debt, and creditors had begun circling the property with increasing boldness. But poverty was not the worst burden Isabella carried. Her family name had been stained long before the money disappeared. Years earlier, her mother, Margaret Hartwell, had been accused of passing confidential royal information to enemies of the crown. No court had ever formally convicted her, yet society had needed no verdict. Invitations stopped arriving. Old friends disappeared. Whispers followed Margaret into every room, until she eventually died, with the word traitor still attached to her name. Isabella had grown up beneath that shadow. So when Alexander unexpectedly proposed marriage, everyone believed they understood why. The Hartwell lands bordered Ravenscroft territory. To society, it looked like a convenient acquisition for a powerful duke and a fortunate rescue for a ruined young woman. Isabella accepted for one reason she could admit to herself. Becoming Duchess of Ravenscroft would save the estate, but more importantly, it would protect the families who depended upon it, the tenants, servants, and workers who would suffer if Hartwell collapsed. What she refused to admit was that she had loved Alexander long before he ever proposed. Years earlier, at a royal gathering, another nobleman had mocked her mother's disgrace within Isabella's hearing. Alexander had quietly ended the humiliation and treated Isabella with a dignity almost no one else had offered her. She had never forgotten it. Alexander carried a secret of his own. He had admired Isabella's strength for years, but his reserved manner made affection look almost identical to duty, and so they approached their wedding with neither understanding the other. Then, 3 days before the ceremony, Isabella found an unsigned message beneath her bedroom door. It contained only one warning: do not marry the Duke. Some graves should remain closed, she told no one. But during the wedding ceremony, she caught Alexander's uncle, Lord Edmund Ravenscroft, staring at her from across the chapel. There was no anger in his face. There was fear. Hours later, after the celebrations ended, an elderly Hartwell servant secretly placed a small wooden box among Isabella's belongings. Margaret Hartwell had left strict instructions years earlier. The box was to be given to Isabella only if she ever became the Duchess of Ravenscroft. Inside was the letter Alexander would find on their wedding night, and Isabella had no idea that someone had already tried to steal it. Back in the bridal chamber, Alexander's attention remained fixed on the letter in Isabella's hands. She hesitated before giving it to him, not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she had only finished reading it moments before he entered the room. The truth inside it had barely settled in her own mind. At last, she placed the first page in his hand. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to his father, Duke Richard Ravenscroft. Alexander began reading, expecting perhaps some forgotten business between their families. Instead, the first lines thanked Margaret Hartwell for saving his son's life. Alexander stopped. 18 years earlier, when he was 14, his carriage had overturned on a country road during a journey back to Ravenscroft. He still remembered the shattered wood, the terrified horses, and the weeks he spent recovering. All his life, he had been told it was an accident. According to his father's letter, it was not. Someone had deliberately weakened one of the carriage wheels. Margaret Hartwell had discovered the plot before the conspirators could make another attempt. She had secretly intercepted letters between those involved and tried to place the evidence in Duke Richard's hands. But someone discovered what she had done. The stolen correspondence was planted among Margaret's possessions instead, making it appear that she had been passing royal information to enemies of the crown. The scandal that destroyed her reputation had been manufactured, and she had accepted that disgrace because exposing the truth too soon would have placed Alexander in even greater danger. For the first time, Alexander understood what Isabella's family had lost because of him. Then, he reached a sentence that made his blood run cold. When it was finally safe, his father had written, the Hartwell name was to be restored, whatever the cost to Ravenscroft. Alexander searched for the explanation that should have followed. There wasn't one. The final page had been torn away. Whoever had removed it had taken the name of the person responsible with it. Then Alexander noticed a narrow groove along the bottom of the wooden box. A hidden compartment opened beneath his fingers. Inside lay a small iron key and a single folded note. The message was brief. The proof remained at Ravenscroft, and Isabella was to trust no one who feared her marriage. Alexander immediately thought of the one man who had opposed that marriage more fiercely than anyone else, his uncle Edmund, and suddenly, the scandal that had destroyed Isabella's mother no longer looked like an old Hartwell tragedy. It looked like a Ravenscroft secret. Alexander wanted to confront Edmund before the night was over. After everything he had just read, restraint felt almost impossible. Edmund had opposed the marriage from the beginning, and now the warning inside Margaret's box seemed to point directly toward him. But Isabella stopped Alexander before anger could outrun reason. They had suspicion. They had fragments of a story. What they did not have was proof. If Edmund was innocent, accusing him would tear the Ravenscroft family apart for nothing. And if he was guilty, warning him too soon might give him time to destroy whatever evidence remained. Alexander understood the logic, but Isabella's caution frustrated him. Every time he pressed her for more, she seemed to retreat further behind thoughts she would not share. Isabella was frightened for a different reason. The deeper they searched, the more certain she became that whatever had destroyed her mother was tied to Alexander's family. She had spent years imagining the truth would restore the Hartwell name. She had never considered that it might destroy the man she loved. Their wedding night ended without celebration, without tenderness, and without answers. They slept in separate rooms. By morning, Isabella had begun searching Ravenscroft Manor. She questioned older servants about Duke Richard's private study. She asked which rooms had remained locked after his death. Alexander later saw her speaking quietly with the elderly Hartwell servant who had delivered Margaret's box. Each secret conversation fed the uncertainty already growing between them. Edmund noticed, and he knew exactly where to place the knife. He reminded Alexander that the Hartwells had lived under disgrace for 18 years. Then he suggested something Alexander had not allowed himself to consider. Perhaps Isabella had not entered Ravenscroft seeking justice. Perhaps she had entered seeking revenge. Alexander rejected the accusation immediately, but he could not entirely silence it. That evening, Isabella finally entered the late Duke Richard's study. Behind an old portrait, she discovered a small locked compartment. The iron key from her mother's box fitted perfectly. Inside lay a bundle of sealed documents. Before Isabella could open even one, Alexander entered and found his new wife searching through his father's private possessions. The argument came quickly. Alexander demanded the truth. Isabella insisted she was trying to protect him from it. Then she turned back toward the compartment. The documents were gone. Someone had entered the room while they were arguing, and when Alexander looked toward the open doorway, Lord Edmund was standing just outside it. Edmund did not wait long to turn suspicion into accusation. By the following morning, he was telling anyone willing to listen that Isabella had invented the entire story. According to him, the old letters, the hidden compartment, even the warning inside Margaret's box, were nothing more than pieces of an elaborate deception designed to stain the Ravenscroft name. Then he produced something far more dangerous than an accusation, an old document bearing Margaret Hartwell's signature. On the surface, it appeared to confirm everything society had believed for 18 years. The letter suggested that Margaret had knowingly passed information to enemies of the crown. Worse still, several lines implied that the Hartwell family had always intended to regain power through marriage to Ravenscroft. Alexander read the document twice. For the first time, real doubt entered his face. Isabella recognized her mother's signature immediately, but the rest of the page felt wrong. Margaret's hand was familiar to her. The shape of the letters was close, yet the language was too cold, too calculated. Someone had taken a genuine signature and built a lie around it, but proving that was another matter. Before Isabella could defend herself properly, Edmund accused her of stealing documents from Duke Richard's study. Several servants had seen her entering forbidden rooms. Others had heard her questioning members of the household. By midday, Edmund was demanding that she be removed from Ravenscroft Manor until the matter could be investigated. Everyone waited for Alexander to decide. He had every reason to doubt his bride. He had known her only briefly, as his wife. His uncle had helped raise him. The evidence against Isabella appeared convincing. Yet when the moment came, Alexander refused to surrender her. Whatever questions remained, he made one thing clear before the household. Isabella was the Duchess of Ravenscroft, and no one would remove her from her own home. For Isabella, that choice changed something. Until then, she had believed Alexander had married her from obligation. But a man protecting only his family name would have abandoned her the moment she became inconvenient. Alexander had not. That night, the elderly Hartwell servant returned with one final piece of information. Margaret had known the original evidence might someday disappear, so she had made a copy, and she had hidden it somewhere Edmund would never think to search: the abandoned Ravenscroft chapel. Alexander and Isabella went there together. Behind a loose stone beneath the old altar, they found a packet of brittle correspondence. The letters revealed that Alexander's carriage accident had indeed been arranged. One man had ordered the wheel weakened. One man had arranged for Margaret to be blamed when she discovered the conspiracy. Most of the final signature had been burned away. Only 2 letters remained: E.R. Edmund Ravenscroft. Then footsteps sounded behind them. Edmund stood at the entrance to the chapel. He did not deny what they had found. Instead, he calmly revealed that Margaret's silence had concealed something even darker. And when Alexander turned toward Isabella, he saw fear in her face, because there was still one part of her mother's story Isabella had kept from him, the one secret connected directly to the tears he had seen on their wedding night. Edmund's confidence finally broke when Alexander's guards closed around him. For years, he had survived because every dangerous truth had been scattered. One letter hidden, one witness silenced, one memory doubted. But now too many pieces had come together in the same room, and the story that emerged was darker than Alexander had imagined. 18 years earlier, Edmund had believed that if Alexander died young, control of Ravenscroft would eventually fall into his hands. So he arranged what everyone later accepted as a tragic carriage accident. Margaret Hartwell discovered the plot before Edmund could try again. But exposing him was not simple. Edmund threatened Alexander's life. He threatened Isabella's father. He made it clear that anyone Margaret loved could become the next victim if she spoke too soon. So Margaret made an impossible choice. She allowed herself to be disgraced. While society whispered that she had betrayed the crown, she secretly placed the real evidence in Duke Richard's hands. Alexander's father promised that once his son was safe, Margaret's name would be publicly restored. That promise was never fulfilled. Duke Richard died before he could expose Edmund. And afterward, Edmund became one of the most influential men in young Alexander's life. He controlled the household records, he removed letters, he destroyed anything that might connect him to the carriage sabotage. Most importantly, he allowed Margaret Hartwell to remain a traitor in the eyes of society. But one question still troubled Alexander. Years had passed. Isabella had grown older. Why had Margaret never spoken when the immediate danger seemed to be over? The answer came from the elderly Hartwell servant. There was another letter. This one had been written directly to Isabella. Margaret had remained silent because Edmund's threat had changed. If she ever exposed him, Isabella would pay for it. So Margaret chose her daughter's safety over her own reputation. The truth devastated Alexander. His inheritance, his title, even the fact that he had lived long enough to become duke had been protected by a woman his own family had allowed the world to condemn. Yet, as the others spoke, Alexander noticed that Isabella still looked as though one final weight remained on her heart. There had been another page inside the wooden box, a page Isabella had hidden before he entered the bridal chamber. Now she finally placed it in his hands. It was Margaret's final message to her daughter. The letter began by acknowledging the impossible coincidence that had brought Isabella to marry the very boy Margaret had once risked everything to save. But Margaret made one thing painfully clear. Isabella owed Alexander nothing. Not gratitude, not loyalty, not marriage, and if there was no love in her heart for him, she was to walk away freely. Only then did Alexander begin to understand the tears he had seen on their wedding night. Because Isabella had read those words only minutes after marrying the man she had secretly loved for years. At last, Isabella told Alexander what those tears had truly meant. She had not been crying because she regretted becoming his wife. She had not been frightened by the title of Duchess, and there had never been another man waiting somewhere in her heart. She had cried because, on the very night she married Alexander, she discovered that her mother had sacrificed her name, her place in society, and years of her life to keep him alive. And Margaret's final wish had been that her daughter should never feel bound to repay that sacrifice. The cruelest part was that Isabella needed no obligation. She already loved him. She had loved Alexander for years. It had begun at a royal winter ball, long before any marriage was discussed. Isabella had stood quietly among nobles, who still whispered about Margaret Hartwell. When one gentleman made a particularly cruel remark about her mother's disgrace, Alexander had stepped in. He had not made a spectacle of defending her. He had simply made it clear that no one would insult Isabella or her mother in his presence. To Alexander, it had been a small act of decency. To Isabella, it had meant everything. Yet she had never imagined he could feel the same way. When his proposal came years later, she convinced herself that he pitied her circumstances. Perhaps he wanted the Hartwell land. Perhaps he felt responsible for protecting a ruined family. Love seemed the least likely explanation. Alexander could hardly believe what he was hearing, because Isabella had misunderstood him just as completely. He had been quietly negotiating with Hartwell's creditors for months before proposing. He had protected parts of the estate without allowing Isabella to know he was responsible. Not because he wanted the land, because he wanted her. And he had hidden his feelings because he feared the Ravenscroft name carried too much pain for Isabella ever to willingly choose him. Their marriage had begun with two people deeply in love, each convinced the other had entered it only from duty. But before they could begin again, Alexander still had one choice to make. Edmund warned that exposing the full truth would disgrace Ravenscroft. Society would learn that a member of the ducal family had attempted murder and destroyed an innocent woman's reputation. Alexander chose the truth anyway. At a formal hearing before representatives of the crown and assembled nobles, the surviving letters were presented. Margaret Hartwell was declared innocent, and Edmund's crimes were exposed before the same society that had once condemned her. Edmund was taken into custody. Alexander then requested something far more important than punishment. Margaret's name was to be cleared from every official record. For Isabella, that moment mattered more than vengeance ever could. Later, Alexander returned Margaret's final letter to her and reminded Isabella that her mother had said she owed him nothing. All he wanted now was for her to remain because she chose him. Isabella already had, and when Alexander finally kissed his bride, there was no arrangement between them anymore, only the love both had been too afraid to name. Several months later, the name Margaret Hartwell no longer carried the stain of treason. Her innocence had been formally proclaimed. The Hartwell estate had been restored, and the woman society had once condemned was finally remembered for what she had truly done. At Ravenscroft Manor, her portrait now hung in the main gallery where every visitor could see it. And Alexander and Isabella had changed as well. There were no more guarded conversations, no more silent assumptions, no more fear that love had to remain hidden behind duty. One evening, Alexander found Isabella standing beneath her mother's portrait. There were tears on her cheeks again. For the briefest moment, he remembered their wedding night. Then he smiled. This time, there was no fear in those tears. Isabella was simply overwhelmed by the thought that her mother's sacrifice had not ended in bitterness, disgrace, or revenge. It had ended here, with truth restored, with two families freed from an 18-year lie, and with the daughter Margaret had protected, standing beside the man she had once risked everything to save. The first time Alexander saw his bride cry, he believed she wished she had never married him. He could not have been more wrong. She had been grieving for her mother, terrified by what the truth might destroy, and overwhelmed by discovering that the marriage she thought had been built on duty had actually brought her to the man she had loved all along. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson the Duke learned from his marriage, that the tears we fear most sometimes hide a love we never knew was there. If you enjoyed this story of hidden love, royal secrets, and a duchess who carried the truth for far too long, subscribe to this channel for more unforgettable Duke and Duchess stories. And tell me in the comments, when did you first realize Isabella wasn't crying because she regretted marrying the Duke?